I'm Charles Payne.
I'm Kat Timpf.
I'm Stuart Varney, and this is the Fox News Rundown.
Friday, April 21st, 2023. I'm Chris Foster. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. joins the Democrats' 2024 presidential race.
All the polling out there is that the majority of Democrats do not want Biden as their nominee the next time. But the fact of the matter is, if he is an incumbent runs, he's going to get the nomination.
We're speaking with Fox News Sunday host Shannon Bream.
And Lisa Brady. Standing your ground or breaking the law. Recent shootings renewing questions about the legal limits of self-defense in America.
What it essentially comes down to is using your common sense. Do you think this person acted reasonably or not? And it's a very fact-intensive inquiry.
And I'm Vivek Ramaswamy, and I've got the final word on the Fox News Rundown.
Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is challenging President Biden for the Democrats' 2024 presidential nomination.
My mission over the next 18 months of this campaign and throughout my presidency will be to end the corrupt merger of state and corporate power.
He's the fourth member of his family to run for president. His uncle John, of course, won in 1960. His father, Bobby, was killed during the 1968 campaign, which he started before President Johnson announced he would not run again. His uncle Ted ran unsuccessfully in 1980 against incumbent President Jimmy Carter. And now RFK Jr. is running against another incumbent Democrat.
Obviously, he knows there's no chance that he is going to win the Democratic nomination, most especially because we think the current president is actually going to run.
Shannon Bream's the host of Fox News Sunday.
In any case, it would seem impossible. But gosh, I say that and I'm thinking now, like, the last few years of politics has blown up any kind of normal expectations. Like, I guess we should be open to anything that could happen. But I think that he wants to be a voice in this conversation. And I think that, gosh, the left doesn't like him because he has not been a fan of the COVID vaccine. He's against vaccines in general. They don't like a lot of what he's got to say. So he's out there, quote unquote, as one of them. But, a lot of folks in the Democratic Party aren't on board with him. And I just think he's going to be sort of a thorn in the side a little bit for the Biden administration if he gets people to show up for campaign events and is able to kind of needle the president a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, he's known for the anti-vaccine stuff. He's been an environmental lawyer for decades. Just on name recognition alone, there's this USA Today Suffolk University poll that has Democrats, Biden supporters, or former Biden supporters at least, saying the 14% of them say, yeah, okay, I could get with Robert Kennedy Jr. I mean, 5% say they're Marianne Williamson, the other Democrat officially running.
Right.
She has some 5% of support, 13% undecided. Now, look, it doesn't mean there's any real threat for the president getting the nomination, but it does speaks to enthusiasm come general election time.
Yeah, because we've talked about this. All the polling out there is that the majority of Democrats do not want Biden as their nominee the next time. But the fact of the matter is, if he is an incumbent runs, he's going to get the nomination, and they're not going to cross over and vote for if it's a President Trump or Ron DeSantis or whatever. I mean, the hardcore Democrats are not going to abandon the party just because Biden runs, even though they're saying they don't want him to. So I think that's the calculus. It's all in there for the president that he knows they'll come home to him if he runs.
Yeah. Kennedy maybe is a tribute to his uncle Ted, who kind of pulled the same thing with Jimmy Carter and before the 1980 election. And he was a bit of a thorn in the side there.
Yeah, I think he's got a lot of interesting things to say when he worries about, corporations aligning with government interests in a way that's kind of insurmountable for the average American in a lot of different cases. I think he gets to a lot of what we even hear people on the right saying. I mean, sometimes the issue goes so far around the curve that the two sides meet. And I think he's in some of those places.
Well, in some other potentially not awesome Joe Biden news, we have this IRS whistleblower who, without naming names, but we know who they're talking about, says the Hunter Biden investigation is being mishandled. And so there's more red meat for these congressional committees that are already looking into this.
And it's funny because sometimes people love whistleblowers and sometimes they hate them. Is the whistleblower going to be good for your side or good for the other side? So there are times when, the left has very much celebrated whistleblowers. They've been the key to democracy. They've got to speak out. They've got to root out corruption. We should protect and celebrate them. I don't think they're going to feel that way about this whistleblower, but it is gaining more traction than a lot of the bubbling things that we've seen on the Hunter Biden, on the tax stuff. We know there are ongoing investigations involving Hunter Biden. And so if this person's coming out to say that in some way those were scuttled or not fully fleshed out because of the last name Biden, going to be very interesting. I mean, it's a bold thing to do. I don't think any whistleblower does that lightly because it will cost them in some way. So only a full vetting of this person, an investigation, interviews, whether they're willing to go on the record or not. It's going to be up to Congress to protect this person, at least to the extent that they can ascertain whether what he or she is saying has some merit to it.
Yeah, it doesn't seem like this is an ancillary person with I guess they could have an extra crime, but I mean, their attorney says that they've been high up in this investigation for like 3 years. So, somebody who at least has some authority to talk about what they're talking about. Right. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis. Now, the stuff against Disney has gotten a little bit weedy and municipal. But he's pushing back against Disney. The company's trying to circumvent his taking away some of their self-governing power. Now he's trying to circumvent that. I mean, he obviously doesn't want to look like he was tricked or that he's giving up a fight. But there are some Republicans in Florida in their legislature who are like, come on, enough with the Disney stuff, enough with the culture war stuff. I'm sticking with Trump.
Yeah. And increasingly you have these Florida lawmakers who are, even after meeting with Ron DeSantis, who's been here in Washington, saying, yeah, I met with him and I'm going to go with Trump. Like, that is not good for a potential presidential campaign. And I don't know how much it plays outside the state of Florida. I don't know how much the average person out there is really worried about, which congressional Republicans out of Florida are endorsing DeSantis versus Trump. But those numbers are building. And what we're hearing as a backstory from a number of these Floridian members of Congress is, I tried to reach out to him to work on some policy or work on some issue or some hurricane thing or whatever. I never heard back from his office.
Yeah, you always get these accusations when a governor or a mayor, whoever it is running for a higher office than the one they're in, that they're not doing their job. And it is a tricky balancing act. DeSantis has every right to get out there and start what is eventually supposed to be a presidential campaign, but he still has a job to do in Tallahassee.
He does, and he was just elected. And listen, resoundingly by 19 points there in Florida after he squeaked out a win for his original election to the gubernatorial mansion there in Tallahassee. So he, I think, is feeling very flush with that win for things like going after Disney and, the stuff about gender identity education in the schools and going at Trump. And, there are these PACs supporting him that say, we've got everything lined up. We're ready for you. They're running ads that are actually doing things like playing President Trump's words on the Second Amendment. They had a very interesting ad that came out when he was at the NRA, kind of like, no one will ever touch your guns. When I'm in the White House, you'll never have to worry about that. And this PAC supporting DeSantis comes out with a campaign that shows him saying, like, maybe we're okay with bump stocks. Maybe we're okay with red flag laws. I mean, in his own words. So he's doing most of the unleashing of the firepower on DeSantis, but those supporting DeSantis are starting to spend money and push back. So we'll see if they really get into a bloody face-to-face mano fight, whether DeSantis is up for it.
Yeah. And there's this Trump supporting ad goofing on these anecdotes about DeSantis eating pudding with his fingers.
Mm-hmm. Who among us has not done that?
Right. I mean,
No, I don't know. They'll find anything to go after each other about, right. Though. So yes, pudding gate, apparently. Yeah. It makes me flash back to the stories about Senator Klobuchar eating her salads with a fork.
Yep.
And, I mean, with a comb, because there was no fork. And so politics makes people pick on silly things.
Yeah. House Speaker Kevin McCarthy has laid out in large part a plan to raise the debt limit and cut spending. There's no specifics really about all the cuts that would be made. That would be handled down the road. But there are specifics about things like stopping the president's plans to forgive student loan debt and refund the IRS. Of course, this is never going to pass the Senate, but Biden has been saying what's your offer, and now here it is.
The two sides are using such extreme language about each other, which is the way they do it in Washington. But it makes you wonder how they give each other any kind of off ramp to get together and work on something. If you actually care about the country and not defaulting and getting our fiscal house in order, none of us at home can run our budgets or our checkbooks the way that the federal government does. And so it's insulting to the American people. Republicans, when they're in charge, spend a ton of money. Democrats, when they're in charge, spend a ton of money. The two sides want to point fingers at each other now, but with McCarthy laid down this marker now and putting out this potential proposal, I mean, it's the White House's move at this point. I mean, they continue to say that everything they see from Republicans is nothing but, quote, MAGA extremism. But at some point with something on the table, you have to then have a conversation.
Yeah. Finally, Shannon, I know Supreme Court lover, as I point out. This case about the Christian mail carrier who doesn't want to work Sundays is interesting. Lower court ruled against him. Seems like there's more sympathy for him in the Supreme Court.
Yeah, it does. It's interesting because when he was hired by the Postal Service, they didn't have Sunday service. Then when they contracted with Amazon to do Sunday service, he said, I can't work Sundays. It's a Sabbath for me. And they said, fine. They were able to, either he got the shift covered or the Postal Service did. Well, there came a union agreement at some point, and there were more and more complaints by employees who didn't want to cover his Sunday shift. He started to get disciplined, and finally he quit. He says, I knew I was going to be terminated, so I quit. So the question is, how much of a hardship does an employer have to bear to be able to accommodate a religious request from an employee? And years ago in 1977, there was a Supreme Court case that said anything beyond a de minimis cost, so like the very most basic inconvenience for the employer, they could say that's an undue hardship. So, people supporting the postal worker will say, employers have no motivation to have any kind of negotiation with the employee because they know they're probably going to get away with saying, we tried and it didn't work. So I think that, listen, nobody could give a bright line test that they think is workable. Is it a dollar amount for the employer? Is it morale? Is it people quitting? But I think that you'll push beyond the de minimis cost. I think that the court is going to elevate that standard in some way, to say that there has to be something a little bit more substantive at issue for the employer before they can simply say, no, we tried and this doesn't work for us. But nobody really had that bright line test. So I'll be interested to see, they have their first little private vote on it Friday, and then we wait months to figure out what they've actually decided. So I can't wait to see who writes this and how they find a solution.
Yeah. And are there going to be ramifications for the broader workforce, or is this limited to this case? I mean, are you going to have, there are a lot of not 24/7, but there are a lot of 7-day-a-week businesses where people have to work Sunday. Somebody has to work Sunday. And,
right.
What's to stop somebody who wants to be brazen about it and say, nah, I'm not working Sundays. I got to go to church, even if they don't.
Right. And, it was interesting. Justice Alito pointed out there are a number of different religious groups from all kinds of different faiths and different backgrounds who filed in this case and said, whether it's a wardrobe issue or grooming issue or something that's related to a religious observance or wanting Saturday off as a Sabbath. I mean, there are all kinds of different groups who've come forward to say the current state of the law has meant that we've been discriminated against. We haven't been able to get basic religious protections in because the employer has said, based on this 1977 case, I really don't have to negotiate with you that much. So although this case is about an evangelical Christian, it certainly does have wide-ranging, potentially, implications.
Shannon Bream, thanks a lot. Good to talk to you. We'll see you Sunday on the TV.
See you then.
This is Vivek Ramaswamy with your Fox News commentary coming up.
A string of recent incidents appearing to stem from simple mistakes are reigniting debate about self-defense in the U.S.
This is a very sad case of some young adults that were looking for a friend's house and ended up at this man's house.
In a rural New York town, Washington County Sheriff Jeffrey Murphy says the group's 2 vehicles were leaving the driveway when the suspect fired 2 shots from his porch, hitting 20-year-old Kaylin Gillis, who was killed. That homeowner is charged with second-degree murder. In Missouri, felony charges for an 84-year-old homeowner after a teenage boy was shot and injured when he went to the wrong address to pick up his younger siblings.
This 16-year-old should not have been shot in the head and then shot once more. That's the reason for the outrage.
Kansas City Mayor Quinton Lucas, after that shooting, sparked weekend protests. In Texas, 2 teenage cheerleaders were shot after opening the wrong car door. And this 6-year-old girl is lucky to be alive in North Carolina.
He walked through his yard and he said he was going to kill the kid.
She and her dad were shot while trying to retrieve a runaway basketball from a man's yard.
And when he went to the ground, the guy continued to shoot. He didn't care who he shot.
The 6-year-old girl was grazed by a bullet in her cheek. That homeowner faces multiple charges, but multiple law enforcement agencies were still looking for him last night.
The theory of our Constitution is that every human being has a natural right of self-defense.
Andy McCarthy is a former assistant U.S. attorney and a Fox News contributor.
It's often mistakenly assumed that our right to keep and bear arms, for example, is provided by the Second Amendment. That's actually not true. What the framers believed was that everyone had a natural right of self-defense, and the Second Amendment is there to ensure that right that existed before the United States existed and existed before, obviously, the Second Amendment did. So it's a fundamental natural right, and it's been widely understood that way, since there have been human beings, really.
Mm-hmm. How much latitude do states have on this issue? We come to, what's known as the castle doctrine and then stand your ground laws. Can states put as many or as few restrictions as they want on self-defense?
Well, there is a certain zone of protection that you get out of the Second Amendment that states would not be able to restrict. So, for example, the courts have now made it clear that we all have a right to bear arms, and we have a right to bear arms in the home for purposes of self-defense. So that much is clear, and the states have traditionally very broad authority with respect to police power within the state and activities within their borders. So there are some states that try as hard as they can to limit as far as they can your ability to use or carry a firearm for purposes of self-defense. And how far they'll be able to go with those kinds of restrictions is something that it's hard to say, because that hasn't really been completely litigated at this point. Some states are more forgiving to the firearm owner in terms of how much latitude there is in perceiving that you are threatened. And other states try to lean the other way so that as a practical matter, the right almost disappears. But again, if they restrict too much, you would have the right to go into court and say your Second Amendment rights were being violated.
In the Missouri case, where a homeowner, Andrew Lester, is facing felony charges for shooting a teenager who went to his house by mistake while he was trying to pick up his younger siblings, the teen, Ralph Yarl, rang the doorbell. How critical is that for the prosecutors in that case?
It's an important fact, because what all these cases eventually will come down to is whether the homeowner acted reasonably. That is, was the person in reasonable fear that his rights as a homeowner were being violated, that his space was being violated in a threatening way. So, is it important that somebody was ringing the doorbell as opposed to, breaking in the door? Of course, that's an important fact. On the other hand, it's not necessarily a dispositive fact, because you can imagine any number of circumstances where somebody who was intending to be threatening to people inside a home would actually ring the bell rather than break in. So, it's going to depend, as it does in all these cases, on what all the facts and circumstances were, and whether the jury thinks that adding it all up, the person acted reasonably or not.
How sympathetic are juries to self-defense claims?
I think they're generally very sympathetic, but juries are just like you and me, right? I mean, they're people from the community, and they are influenced by all the things that would make us sympathetic or unsympathetic. So I think whenever you ask, how sympathetic jurors are, I think it's fair to say that, depending on whether you're in a region or a place where there's a strong gun culture, and by that I mean a strong sense of personal self-defense responsibility, where it's a common thing for people to own firearms for self-defense, the homeowner in those areas tends to get a lot of sympathy from jurors. On the other hand, in many cities across the United States, there is an anti-gun culture. And I think because people are raised in that milieu, they may tend to be less sympathetic to a homeowner who tries to defend himself, but they will apply the law. And if the judge tells them that we have a right to self-defense, and that if somebody had a reasonable perception that he was in danger or his family was in danger, It's very hard for prosecutors to get a conviction under those circumstances because the jury has to find beyond a reasonable doubt that there was a homicide.
For prosecutors, race is sometimes also a factor in these types of cases. And in the Missouri case, the homeowner's white. The teenager who did survive the shooting is black. Legally speaking, though, how much is that a factor?
Legally speaking, it shouldn't be a factor at all. In other words, the laws themselves that we apply and the legal instructions that judges give to juries don't factor race in because we have race-neutral laws. But of course, the reason that we have jury trials rather than having litigation decided by, say, panels of experts or even judges is because you want to bring the community's judgment to bear before somebody gets convicted of a crime. So it would be unrealistic to think that attitudes that are held by people in the community won't factor into how a case will go simply because the laws don't mention race and the judge's instructions won't mention race. I've heard lawyers say before that cases are won in jury selection. And what they mean by that is, especially if you're a defense lawyer, you want to have people on the jury who you think will be sympathetic to the kinds of claims you want to make and the kinds of themes that you want to raise in the course of a trial. And if you succeed in getting a jury who you think will be sympathetic to a racial argument, it would be foolish to think that you won't be hearing racial arguments.
Another potentially tricky thing for the defense in one recent case would seem to be the age of the victim. There's a big difference in some of these recent cases. The 16-year-old boy, in another case, a 20-year-old woman, and then a 6-year-old girl. It would seem pretty hard to argue that you needed to protect yourself from a 6-year-old whose ball rolled into the yard.
Yeah, and I think, Lisa, based on your questions, you're really getting to what these cases come down to. It's always nice to be the lawyer who gets asked, what do you think will happen here? What do you think will happen there? But the fact is, the kinds of things that you're underscoring here show that what this comes down to are fact questions that jurors are going to be called on to resolve. Not so much, they'll be given legal principles, but one thing that a jury gets told by any good litigator is that we don't want you to check your common sense at the door. And the kinds of facts that you're raising, which go to the heart of whether somebody is acting reasonably or not when they try to defend themselves, are exactly what the jury will have to wrestle with. And I wish I could sit here and tell you, there's a solid legal answer, that if you give me these 3 facts, this is how the case should come out. But it really doesn't work that way. So a lot of cases are in the gray area where you can easily see that a person might have perceived danger who was in the home and had a firearm. And you could also easily see that the person who was trying to get into the home, whether by mistake or in some unthreatening way, didn't intend and objectively didn't seem to be particularly threatening, but that it's possible that a person in the situation in the home might have taken it as threatening. And those are the really hard cases. They're the ones where all the things that you're raising now, like the age and the appearance of the person at the door, whether the person rang the bell, all those things will be scrutinized by the jury. But what it essentially comes down to is using your common sense. Do you think this person acted reasonably or not? And it's a very fact-intensive inquiry.
One last thing. I'm just wondering if these kinds of cases are more common than the recent headlines would suggest.
Well, self-defense is a very common scenario that comes up, in cases involving physical confrontations. I think what we may be hitting now, and I don't really feel I know enough to say whether this is so or not so. We could have just had, a weird raft of, unusually difficult situations that came up, in quick in time. I think, most of the time what happens is, you really do have somebody who is a hardened criminal who is up to no good, and you have somebody who is trying to defend his home, his family, his property. And those situations, I mean, it's obviously there's a lot of tragedy that can fall out of them, but they're a lot easier to wrap your brain around than some of the situations that we've been talking about, which are much stickier.
Former federal prosecutor and Fox News contributor Andy McCarthy, thank you as always for your time.
Oh, thanks so much.
And now, some good news with Tanya J. Powers.
The Boston Marathon was held this week, and a 77-year-old woman made history by crossing the finish line for the 37th consecutive time, more than any other woman in the history of the road race. Patty Hung completed her 26.2 miles with a time of 5 hours, 40 minutes, and 37 seconds. Last year, in her 36th running of the marathon, she surpassed the previous record set by Andrea Hatch of Maine, who ended her streak in 2013. Hung was a math teacher, then went back to school later in life to become a nurse. And while she was born and raised in Boston, she now works as a pediatric nurse in Oakland, California. She didn't start running until her late 30s and says it was something that changed her life. Patty says she was looking for her purpose. She had gone through a divorce, was the mother of 3 kids, and needed a challenge. So she decided to run the Boston Marathon and took part in her first one in 1987. She says she's got no plans to stop and that she's going to keep going as long as her body and mind allow her to. Tanya J. Powers, Fox News.
Pull up a chair and join me, Rachel Campos Duffy,
and me, former U.S. Congressman Sean Duffy, as we share our perspective on the discussions happening at kitchen tables across America.
Download From the Kitchen Table, The Duffys, at foxnewspodcasts.com or wherever you download podcasts. Subscribe to this podcast at foxnewspodcasts.com.
It's time for your Fox News commentary.
Vivek Ramaswamy.
What's on your mind?
Remember the Bud Light campaign during the 2016 election season? The beer behemoth paid outspoken left-wing celebrities, Amy Schumer and Seth Rogen, to tip their hat to Democrats. The only person that ad would ever convince to crack open a cold one is Senator Elizabeth Warren. Now the king of beers is paying homage to the newest cultural zeitgeist by paying trans activist Dylan Mulvaney to prod grown men into dressing like Audrey Hepburn while drinking beer. For a drink that was once a blue-collar staple of middle America, this is not a winning sales strategy. It's a way for the CEO to signal his virtue while alienating a customer base that is too afraid to say it out loud. One of my goals of my candidacy for president of the United States is to close the gap between what people are willing to say behind closed doors and what they are willing to say in public. So in that spirit, here goes. Dylan Mulvaney might need mental health care, not endorsement deals. More often than not, when somebody identifies as a gender different from their biological sex, that is a sign and symptom that they're suffering from a mental illness. I reject the idea that it is somehow humane to affirm their confusion rather than to actually help them. That is inhumane. Here's the reality. Transgenderism is not a civil rights issue. It is a social contagion. Psychological epidemics have been well documented for over 300 years, as my friend Jordan Peterson has rightly identified. Western culture is periodically consumed by these social psychoses that grip certain groups into hysteria, especially the most vulnerable among us. This cult of gender ideology increasingly foists sexuality upon our children. Look at Drag Queen Story Hour. Makes a mockery of women. Look at the fact that they can't answer what is a woman. It undermines female sports. Look at Leo Thomas and countless others by creating a zero-sum game where men with mental health disorders dominate at the expense of women. But by hitching itself to this ever-growing alphabet soup of queer rights, the trans movement has successfully wrapped itself in a veneer of legitimacy and shuts down rational debate or reasonable criticism. The trans movement now tells us that your own sex, your biological sex, is entirely fluid over your life, even though there is a definitive sex chromosome. These two beliefs are impossible to espouse at the same time. When this social contagion finally ends, those who stood up to it from J.K. Rowling to Jordan Peterson, they're going to be remembered as compassionate thought leaders who saved our culture from that cult, even as they are publicly flogged. Let's abandon this farce that the humane thing to do is to affirm gender confusion rather than to actually help those who suffer from it. That's what it means to crack a cold, hard truth. My name is Vivek Ramaswamy. I'm running as a Republican for U.S. president. I wrote a book called Woke Inc. Inside Corporate America's Social Justice Scam, and I'm looking to revive the essence of our national soul.
You've been listening to the Fox News Rundown. And now, stay up to date by subscribing to this podcast at foxnewspodcasts.com. Listen ad-free on Fox News Podcasts Plus on Apple Podcasts. And Prime members can listen to the show ad-free on Amazon Music. And for up-to-the-minute news, go to foxnews.com.